Welcome, beautiful soul. The angels are wrapping you in pure golden light right now, right in this very moment. You are so deeply loved, so completely protected, and so tenderly guided by forces of love and light that you cannot even fully see yet. Welcome to Angel's message for you. This is your sacred space, and today's message was meant to reach you. Could not be more perfectly timed. Before you read another word, I want you to do something for me. Take one slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders drop. Let your heart soften just a little, because what is about to be revealed to you today is something so powerful, so real, and so beautifully life-changing that your heart is going to recognize it before your mind even has a chance to catch up. Stay with me all the way to the very end, because the angels saved the most important part for last. And trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming. What the angels have to share at the end of this message has the power to shift everything. The way you see yourself, the way you understand love, and the way you move forward from this day. You were brought here today for a reason. There are no accidents when the angels are involved. Every step that led you here, every click, every scroll, every quiet moment that found you landing on these words was guided. You were called here by something larger than chance. And the reason is this: something has shifted in the universe around you. Something very big has been set in motion, and it could not wait another single moment to reach you. The angels came to me with great urgency, moving swiftly through the invisible space between heaven and this present moment, because a love so pure and so powerful has been sent directly into the heart of someone who deeply, truly, sincerely cares for you. And this love, it is so full, so complete, so absolutely certain, that there is no longer any room left in that heart for anyone or anything else. You are the one. You have always been the one. And the universe could not let another moment pass without making sure you knew it. Right now, as you take in these words, know that you are being embraced by something sacred. The angels have been listening, not just to you, but to the heart of the person who loves you. And what they heard was so beautiful, so deeply honest, so radiantly full of light, that they knew with certainty that it had to reach you tonight. Could not wait until tomorrow. Could not be held back one more day. This is not a coincidence. You did not find these words by accident. You were guided here because something has already been decided in the spiritual realm, and now the physical world is simply catching up to what the soul already knows. There is a heart out there that is completely full of you. Not halfway, not sometimes, not in uncertain moments, completely, fully, overflowing. Every corner of that heart, every single thought that moves through it, every quiet moment before sleep, every early morning when the world is still and soft, all of it carries you. Your name, your energy, your presence, the peace that only you bring. The angels told me that this love did not arrive all at once. It came in like a warm, gentle light that slowly, steadily, undeniably spread through every part of this person's being. Came in quietly, and then it stayed, and it grew, and it became so rooted, so deep, so undeniable, that tonight it opened up completely, like a flower that had been waiting for the right season. Tonight was the night it bloomed. What you are feeling right now as you read these words, that warm stirring in your chest, that sense that something is about to change, that quiet knowing that something real is happening, that is your own soul recognizing the truth of what is being sent to you. That is your heart already saying yes before the words have fully arrived. That is your spirit confirming what the angels already know. You are loved. You are chosen. You are desired in a way that goes far beyond the ordinary and reaches straight into the extraordinary. The angels let me see what lives inside the heart of the person who loves you, and I want you to know, it was breathtaking. There were no doubts hiding in the corners. No hesitations tucked behind the surface. No searching glances toward any other door. Just a pure, steady, radiant certainty that said quietly and with complete peace, "It is you. It has always been you. There is no one else." This person does not need to look anywhere else, because everything they have ever been searching for, everything they ever hoped love could feel like, they have already found. In you. In the way you make the world feel lighter simply by being in it. In the quiet comfort of simply knowing you exist somewhere in this world. That is what true love does. It does not wander. It does not settle for something less. It arrives. It recognizes. It stays. And it says, with a peace that only comes from the soul, "I am home." This love has arrived. This love has recognized you. And this love is here to stay. Dear precious soul, the peace I felt radiating from this heart when it opened up through the angels was unlike anything else. There is a particular kind of peace that only exists when the heart has finally stopped its searching, when it has found what it was always meant to find, and it knows, without any shadow of doubt, that the searching is over. That peace was everywhere in what was shown to me. It surrounded every thought, every feeling, every silent wish that was being sent through the invisible pathways of love toward you tonight. This was not a decision made in a moment of emotion that will fade by morning. This was a decision made in the deepest part of the soul. And decisions made in the soul do not change with time. They do not weaken. They do not doubt themselves when things get hard. They only deepen. They only grow clearer. They become more solid and more certain with every passing day. You were not chosen because of what you do. You were recognized because of who you are. Your energy, the light you carry even in the moments when you do not feel it shining. The way you move through the world with your particular kind of grace. The quiet strength in you that persists even on the hard days when everything feels heavy. All of it was seen. All of it was felt. And all of it became the reason why this heart could not hold anyone or anything else. You filled every space inside it. You settled into every corner. And there is simply no room left. Not because this heart is closed to the world, but because it is so completely and joyfully full of you. You are the first thought in the morning, the last feeling before sleep, the name that echoes in the quiet moments between everything else, the presence that makes the whole world make sense when nothing else does. That is who you are to this person. That is the kind of love being sent to you right now, flowing through these words like a river of pure light. The angels shared with me the full depth of what this person feels for you. And it is not a small thing. It is not casual. It is not uncertain or wavering or conditional. It is the kind of love that plants itself like a great tree in the most fertile ground and grows without stopping. Through the seasons, through the rains, through the dry spells, always growing, always reaching, always becoming more itself. The roots of this love go down deep, far deeper than words can describe. And what grows above the surface is something extraordinary. Something you can see. Something you can feel. Something that will not be pulled up or blown away by the storms of life. You deserve to know this. You deserve to feel this. You deserve to let it fully in. So right now, as you move through these words, allow yourself to soften. Allow your heart to open just a little more than it was before you started reading. Allow the universe to deliver to you what has already been prepared and sent with such sincere, patient, radiant love. You do not have to earn this. You do not have to do anything at all. You simply have to receive. There is a connection between you and this person that cannot be explained by ordinary logic. It lives in the space between heartbeats. It moves through thoughts without asking permission. It shows up in dreams. It is felt in moments of stillness when the noise of the world falls away and all that remains is a quiet, certain knowing. This connection is not random. It is not an accident of circumstance. The angels recognize it as something sacred, a soul-level bond that was woven long before either of you even had words to describe what you were to each other. And that bond is alive. That bond is real. And it is pulling you closer, even now, even through these very words, even through the invisible threads of divine energy that connect all souls who are meant for each other. Trust it. Dear one, this person has been carrying something beautiful inside for a long time. A love that has only grown with time rather than faded. The kind of love that does not fade when things get complicated or unclear or when distance enters the picture. The kind of love that actually becomes stronger under pressure, the way gold is refined and purified by fire. No distraction, no outside voice, no passing temptation, no long stretch of silence has been able to loosen the hold that this feeling has taken on their heart. Every time they tried to look away, something would bring them back. Every time the world offered something easier to chase, the heart quietly, firmly said, no, not that. The one I already know. The one who already has this space. The one who already fills every corner of me without even trying. That space is yours. It was yours from the moment you entered this person's life in a real way. And nothing and no one will ever replace you there. That is not wishful thinking. That is spiritual truth. And the angels confirm it. The angels showed me something I need to share with you very clearly. This love is no longer living in uncertainty. There was a time, perhaps not so long ago, when things were still being sorted through, when feelings were being understood, when the heart was still learning the full measure of what it was carrying. But that season has passed. The confusion has cleared. The light has come fully in. The sorting is done. And what remains, what stands firm and radiant and unshakable in the center of that heart, is you. Only you. Precious soul. I want you to take a breath and really let that settle. You are someone whose presence fills another person's entire world. Your energy touches places in someone else's heart that nothing and no one else ever reached. Your way of being, your specific light, your unique energy, your authentic love, changed something forever inside this person. Something that cannot be unchanged. Something that permanently rearranged the landscape of their inner world. That is not a small thing. That is perhaps the most sacred thing one human being can do for another. The angels want you to understand something very important about the nature of this love. It does not come from a place of need or longing or lack. It comes from wholeness. It comes from a full heart that has found its peace and is now choosing, freely, joyfully, with complete clarity, to share that peace with you. This is not a love that will drain you or ask you to make yourself smaller to fit into it. This is a love that will lift you, that will celebrate who you are, that will walk beside you as a true partner in every sense of the word. This is the love you have been worthy of all along, and it is moving toward you right now. The angels have been walking closely with this person as they have been doing the inner work of preparing to love you fully. They have been watching as old wounds are gently healed. They have been present as old fears are recognized and released. They have witnessed this person choosing again and again to step forward into the light rather than retreat back into the familiar safety of what does not serve them anymore. And through all of it, the name that has stayed constant, the presence that has remained the North Star, the reason behind all of this beautiful growth and change, is you. You have inspired someone to become better, to be more honest with themselves, to stop running from the truth of what they feel and start moving, step by careful step, toward it. That is one of the most profound gifts one soul can offer another. And you gave it simply by being who you are. How extraordinary is that? How deeply, beautifully extraordinary. Dear precious soul, the angels want you to carry this message with you as you move through your days. When doubt tries to creep in, and sometimes it will because that is just part of the human experience, come back to this truth that was given to you tonight. There is a heart out there that holds your name like the most precious thing it has ever been given. There is a love that chose you not by accident but by the deepest and most certain recognition one soul can have for another. You are not waiting for love. Love is already moving toward you. It has been moving toward you for longer than you know. You are not searching for your person. Your person has already found you, first inside their own heart, where the real finding always happens, and soon in every other way that matters. This person does not want to be in your life for just a little while. They want to walk beside you through the seasons of life, through the easy, beautiful days and the difficult, uncertain ones, through the laughing mornings and the long, quiet evenings. They want to be present in your small joys and steady beside you in your harder moments. They are not looking for something perfect because they understand that perfection is not what real love is made of. They are looking for something true, and to them, in the fullest possible sense, you are the most true thing they have ever known. Dear beloved soul, there is a beautiful tenderness in how this love holds every memory of you. Every moment that was shared, even the small ones, even the ones that might have seemed so ordinary at the time, has been kept like something precious and irreplaceable. A smile, a word, a shared silence, a moment of laughter, all of it stored in a sacred place deep inside this person's heart, revisited often, held with the kind of careful reverence you give only to the things you cannot imagine losing. You have never been forgotten, not for a single day, not in even one quiet private moment. Your presence has remained constant in this person's heart, like a star that never goes out, always there, always shining, even when clouds move over it and it seems to disappear for a time. It never disappears. It only waits for the sky to clear, and the sky is clearing now. The love that was always there has grown into something even more remarkable. It has grown into certainty, into deep, peaceful knowing, into the quiet, unshakable confidence that says, "This is the love I choose. This is the love I will protect. This is the love I will walk toward, one honest, tender, faithful step at a time." The angels are singing over this connection right now. Can you feel it? That soft warmth beginning to spread through your chest. As you read, that gentle hum of something holy and certain, that feeling like the universe just leaned in and whispered yes. Yes to this, yes to you, yes to what is being prepared and sent your way. That is divine confirmation. That is the universe itself saying yes to this love. Yes to this connection. Yes to what is coming. You are not imagining it. You are not reading too much into it. This is real. This is true. This is already in motion. Precious protected one, the angels want to paint a picture for you of what is being prepared. Allow yourself for just a moment to imagine a future that is full of warmth. A life where two people who truly see each other and truly know each other choose each other again and again. Not out of habit or obligation, but out of genuine, joyful, freely giving love. A life where the love is not perfect in some airbrushed, unreal way, but honest. Alive, growing, where the days are not always easy, but they are never faced alone. Where even the long silences between two people feel comfortable and full and meaningful, because the presence itself is enough. Where home is not a building or an address but a person. Where you can exhale completely. Where you are known. where you are loved not for the version of yourself you perform for the world, but for the full, beautiful, imperfect truth of who you actually are in your most honest moments. That future is being built right now, not just in imagination, in the spirit realm, in the invisible realm where all things are first created before they appear in the physical world. The foundation is already being laid, and the one doing the building has only one vision in mind, a life shared with you. Dear precious soul, there is a gentle strength in this love that does not demand or rush or pressure. It welcomes without conditions. It waits without resentment. It loves without requiring anything in return. This person does not want to prove anything to the world. They only want to live beside you with simplicity and truth. There is no competition here, no race to win, no performance to maintain. There is only one clear, steady, beautiful certainty. You are the place where this love wants to live, and that place will not be offered to anyone else. That decision was made in silence. It was made in the soul's quiet, in that deep inner space where only the most real truths can emerge. And from that silence came the desire to have you close, to build something together that only the two of you can fully understand, to live a story that belongs only to you both. The love that lives in this heart does not need to be explained or proven or demonstrated with grand gestures. It is simply true. And true things do not need to announce themselves loudly. They are simply felt. They are simply known. They arrive in the body as warmth. They arrive in the spirit as peace. They arrive in the heart as the quiet certainty that says, yes, this is real. Dear beautiful soul, this person wants to be a shelter for you. Not a cage, a shelter. Place of deep rest. A soft landing after hard days. A presence that says without needing any words, you are safe here. You can put down whatever you have been carrying. You do not have to be anything other than exactly what you are. They want to support you when things are hard. They want to celebrate you when things are wonderful. They want to know the parts of you that the world never sees. The tender parts, the uncertain parts, the parts you have not always felt safe showing to just anyone. And they want to love all of those parts with the same steadiness and warmth with which they love the rest of you. This is not a love built on what you can offer or what you can do or what you look like or any of the surface things the world tends to judge by. This is a love built on who you are at the core of your being. And who you are, every layer, every dimension, every depth of you, is exactly what this heart has been waiting for. You fit. You belong. You are the piece that makes everything whole. The angels are standing beside you right now as you receive these words. They are holding space for your heart to open fully to what is being given. They are gently clearing away any old energy, any old hurt, any old voice that whispers that you are not worthy of this kind of love, so that what is coming can arrive in a clean and open and fully ready space. You are worthy. You have always been worthy. The universe has never had any doubt about that, even in the seasons when you doubted yourself. And it has been working behind the scenes all along, moving things into place, clearing paths, dissolving old barriers, so that this love can reach you exactly when the time is right. And the time is getting very, very close. Dear protected one, I want to speak to you now about the signs. You may have been noticing them lately. Small things that seem to carry meaning. A song that came on at exactly the right moment with words that felt meant for you. A thought about this person that arrived out of nowhere, unexpectedly, when you were doing something completely unrelated. That was so vivid and warm that it stayed with you when you woke up and colored your whole morning. A feeling in your body, a warmth in your chest, a quiet sense of knowing in your gut that something is shifting, something is changing, something is about to become much more clear. Those signs are real. They are the universe speaking to you in the language it speaks most fluently, the language of feeling, of symbol, of synchronicity. The angels use these moments to reach through the ordinary fabric of everyday life and touch you with something extraordinary. And every sign that has been pointing toward love, toward connection, toward this specific feeling, all of it has been true. All of it has been leading somewhere real. The universe is conspiring in favor of this connection. Every sign, every dream, every unexpected moment of warmth that arrives when you think of this person, all of it is confirmation. All of it is the divine order of things showing you what is already written in the fabric of this relationship, what already exists in the spiritual realm and is now making its way into the physical. Follow the signs. Trust the feelings. Let the universe guide you forward with confidence and peace. This love is not afraid. It does not hesitate at the edge of what is real. It walks forward with calm faith and the quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly where they are going and exactly who they are going to. They are going to you. Precious soul, the angels want you to know that you are being held right now in more love than you can fully take in. The love coming from this person's heart. The love coming from your guardian angels who have never left your side, not even for one breath. The love coming from the universe itself, which has always been working in your favor, even in the moments when it was impossible to see it, even in the seasons when everything seemed dark and uncertain and you could not imagine how it would ever come together. It is all coming together now. The pieces are finding each other. The love is finding its way. And you, beautiful, worthy, deeply loved you, are exactly where you are supposed to be. You are surrounded by love. You are supported by light. You are never, not even for 1 second, alone in any of this. The path ahead is lit. The love ahead is real. The heart that is completely full of you is ready, and it is moving toward you with everything it has. All you need to do is stay open, stay soft, stay in the light. Trust the timing even when you cannot see all of it yet. Trust the love even when it has not fully arrived in the form you can touch. Trust the angels who have brought you this message tonight because they wanted, more than anything, for you to know the truth. And the truth is this: you are deeply, completely, eternally, and joyfully loved. Not someday, not in some distant possibility. Right now, in this moment, in the heart that beats somewhere in this world with your name at the very center of it. In the quiet spiritual connection that links your soul to the soul of someone who has chosen you with every part of their being. Receive it. Open your arms and your heart and receive all of it. Every drop, every wave, every beautiful, sacred truth that the angels have carried to you tonight. You deserve all of this and more. You have always deserved it, and the universe has always known. As your guardian angels, we will always walk with you, lighting your path in the dark when you cannot see your next step, protecting your spirit from what does not serve your highest good, guiding you gently but surely toward the love and the life that you were always meant to have. We were with you before you even began this journey. We have been beside you through every single chapter of your story, and we will be beside you in every chapter still to come. You are never walking alone. You are always held in something greater than yourself. And the love surrounding you right now, the love from the heavens above, and the love from the heart of the one who has fully and completely chosen you, is not going anywhere. It is infinite. It is eternal. It is patient and kind and true. And it is yours. Stay in the light, precious soul. Trust the love. Trust the journey. Trust the angels who are always near. Something wonderful, something you have been waiting for longer than you fully realize, is already on its way to you. And the angels will be right beside you every single beautiful step of the way, with all the love in heaven, always. Dear precious one, the angels have one more thing they want to share with you before this message is complete. And this is the part one told you to wait for. They want to speak to you about your own heart for a moment. Because so much of this message has been about the love that is being sent to you from outside. But the angels see everything, and they see what is happening inside you too. They see how much you have carried. They see the times you have hoped for something like this and then talked yourself out of believing it was really possible. They see the moments when you have convinced yourself that maybe love this deep was for other people but not for you. They see the walls that went up, built carefully, brick by brick, every time you got hurt or disappointed or felt like the love you gave was not truly received. And the angels want to say to you right now, with the most tender love in all of creation, those walls can come down. You are safe now. You are seen now. You are chosen now. The love coming toward you is not going to hurt you the way some things in the past have hurt you. It is not going to ask you to make yourself smaller. It is not going to arrive and then disappear. It is not going to love you conditionally, or only when it is convenient, or only when you are at your best. This love is the kind that stays, the kind that shows up, the kind that looks at all of you, every beautiful, complicated, perfectly imperfect part, and says yes. All of it. I choose all of it. You are allowed to believe that. You are allowed to let that in. You are allowed to stop waiting for the catch, because there is no catch. There is only this, a heart that is full of you, a love that has chosen you completely, a universe that has been working toward this moment for a very long time. And you, with your whole, open, deserving heart, are finally ready to receive it. The angels want you to do something right now, wherever you are. Whether you are sitting, lying down, standing, whatever feels right, place one hand gently over your heart. Feel it beating. Feel the warmth of your own hand. And say to yourself, quietly or out loud, whichever feels more true, I am worthy of love. I am open to receiving. I allow this love in. You do not have to believe it completely the first time you say it. Just say it. Just let the words move through you. Because the angels are working with every word, every sound your heart makes, every quiet intention you set, to open the channels of love that are already flowing toward you. This is how it works in the spiritual realm. The love is already there. It is already sent. It is already on its way. The only thing that can slow it down is the part of us that does not believe we deserve it. And the moment you say, even just 1% more than before, I am worthy of this, the universe responds. It moves. It accelerates what is already coming. So say it. Believe even just a little bit more today than you did yesterday. Let yourself hope. Let yourself feel the possibility. Let yourself be the person who is loved this deeply, because that is exactly who you are. The angels have one more truth for you before we close this sacred message. There is a reason you were called here today. There is a reason you stayed all the way to the end. That is not something everyone does. It takes a certain kind of soul, an open soul, a seeking soul, a soul that still believes in something greater than what the ordinary world can see, to follow a message all the way through to its final word. You are that kind of soul. You have always been that kind of soul. The angels see it in you. They have always seen it in you. That quiet spark of faith that refuses to go out, even when everything around it tries to blow it down. That deep inner knowing that love is real, that connection is real, that you were made for something more than just going through the motions. You were made for love like this. Real love, steady love, soul-level love, The kind that changes you in the most beautiful ways. The kind that shows you who you are at your absolute best. The kind that makes you feel like you have finally come home. And it is coming for you. It is already here in the invisible. And soon, so very soon, it will be here in the visible too. In your life, in your days, in the most real and tangible and joyful way possible. The angels are celebrating you right now. Right now, in the heavenly realm, there is a celebration happening for you. For your openness, for your courage, for the love you have carried in your heart even through all the difficult seasons. For the fact that you are still here, still believing, still hoping, still showing up for love. That takes incredible strength. And you have it. You have always had it. Go forward now, precious soul. Go forward with the angels beside you and the light of this message in your heart. Go forward knowing that you are held, that you are loved, that you are protected, that the universe is on your side in ways that go deeper than words. The love that has been promised to you is real. The heart that has chosen you is full. And everything that is beautiful and true and meant for you is already on its way. Trust it. Receive it. Live it. The angels love you more than you know, more than this message can hold. They are with you always, in every breath, in every step, in every moment of quiet when you feel that gentle warmth and wonder for just a second if something greater is watching over you. It is. They are. And they are so proud of you. With eternal love and infinite blessings, your guardian angels walk beside you always. Amen.